Yeah, I don't think we need to do the whole like, hey, 3, 2, 1. 'Cause it never works. So we'll just do like the soft openings like every single other podcast does. So,
Except
hello.
ours. Well, that was something we were unique with.
Yes, not the only thing that makes us stand out, but might be the
Probably the
track.
one I'm most proud of.
Yeah, maybe the tractor comments every episode might make us stand out. I don't think any other podcast can claim that.
Do you think that's original? Do you think that's kind of trendy?
Yeah, I mean Bob Murphy has tried, and
He's
I think
tried. He
but
kind of
he's
let that go though recently.
yeah, he just hasn't been able to really execute it that well.
Well, he's not that. Yeah, whatever. I'll keep
Yeah,
my opinions to myself.
yeah, you better. So,
Yeah.
hello everyone, and welcome to episode 160 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is September 2nd, 2019. I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me is Slappy Jones too. And we are both from McFlugel.com. Show notes page for this episode will be McFlugel.com/160, and you'll be able to check out things we talk about as well as buy some awesome libertarian themed mugs by checking out Liberty Mugs. And also, this will be appropriate for this episode, but if you haven't already, go to 10hoursofbitcoin.com. And if you're interested in learning about Bitcoin, that is an excellent resource where you can, make a 10-hour commitment broken up over, I think, 10 different kind of modules, and you can really, really, really get a good understanding of Bitcoin. So happy Labor Day, Slappy. Have you worshipped at the altar of unions today?
Yeah, well, we had an extra long weekend, so thank you, unions, for not only my normal weekend but my extra long one this week. So thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of appropriate because if you haven't figured it out already, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin a little bit, and everyone wants to thank unions for the 2-day weekend, the 40-hour work week, but really, I would argue it's because of sound money.
Yeah, wealth, right?
Yeah, people will be able to save their wealth and have some capital accumulation to make their processes better, become more efficient, and generate more wealth for the world.
And not have to work every waking minute in order to survive.
Right, not have to be subsistence farmers and throw cucumbers at the White House to try to obliterate the state.
Right.
So, why don't you introduce our episode? We're going to get a little bit more specific about a certain topic in Bitcoin. But
sure. Just talking about money and what is money and how do things become money, and why, I guess we'll go on to say why we think that Bitcoin has the best chance of becoming money. Let's get right into it. How does something, what are you talking about when you say monetization? How do you say that word? Monetization?
Yeah.
How does something become monetized?
Well,
monetizationized.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a good idea to maybe take a step back and just talk about why money exists.
Right. What's what's wrong with Federal Reserve notes, for that matter? It's money.
Well, yeah. Well, it is money, but it doesn't really do a good job of allowing you to preserve your wealth. But even taking a step further back, like, what is money? It's funny because I think everyone knows what money is, but I think if you just kind of did a man on the street thing and just polled people to give a good definition of money, they probably wouldn't be able to really give a good answer.
They'd probably say dollar. They'd probably pull out some cash and say, this is money.
Yeah, it's the things that I, use. I get paid in and spend with
it. Yeah.
Right. But they really wouldn't give you a good definition. So I kind of want to cheat a little bit. And I've been reading the book De Moneda by Nicholas Erasme. I think that's how you pronounce it.
But definitely pronounced right.
Yeah, but it's the first treatise on money that's really really well known. And it was I think it was a Catholic bishop who wrote about the ethics of money production. And not ironically, but Guido Holzman, who wrote the book The Ethics of Money Production, referred to this book a lot. So I figured after reading that, I'm like, well, I got to read this book too. And it's really good. It takes it a little bit different in perspective than we might have as libertarians, because he kind of takes the prince for granted and having a state. But it still is still well worth the read. But I want to read chapter 1 Chapter 1's called Why Money Was Invented.
And it's only 62 pages?
Yeah. Actually,
Okay.
the book's not long at all. It's like 90-something pages, and chapters are short. So, because it's an interesting thing, because money is kind of the thing that announces to society, the rest of society, like who brings value. Because you have a system where, like, before money, people were like trading their services, but you have this issue where you have to have a coincidence of wants. So if Slappy produces corn and I make shirts, and I want corn, but Slappy doesn't want shirts, then I've got to find someone who produces something that I think Slappy wants, and then who also wants shirts. So it creates a lot of unnecessary friction. Money is this kind of third thing that is only used for exchanging value, and allows indirect trade to happen. So let me read this. So here we go. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, he separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the people. Next, men were multiplied on the earth, and possessions were divided to the best advantage. The result of this was that one man had more than he needed of one commodity, while another had little or none of it. And of another commodity, the converse was true. The shepherd had abundance of sheep and wanted bread, the farmer the contrary. One country abounded in one thing and lacked another. Men therefore began to trade by barter. One man gave another a sheep for some corn, another gave his labor for bread or wool, and so with other things. And this practice persisted in some states, as Justin tells us, till long afterwards. But as this exchange and transport of commodities gave rise to many inconveniences, men were subtle enough to devise the use of money to be the instrument for exchanging the natural riches of which themselves minister to human needs. For money is called artificial riches, seeing that a man who abounds in it may die of hunger, as appears from Aristotle's example of the greedy king, who prayed that everything he touched should turn to gold, which the gods granted, and he perished of hunger, as the poets tell. For money does not directly relieve the necessities of life, but is an instrument artificially invented for the easier exchange of natural riches. And it is clear without further proof the coin is very useful to the civil community and convenient, or rather necessary, to the business of the state, as Aristotle proves in the 5th book of the Ethics, although Ovid says, "From earth we mine a source of future ill, first iron and then gold, more deadly still. For that is caused by the perverse greed of wicked men, not by money itself, which is a convenience for human intercourse, and whose use is essentially good." Whence Cassiodorus says, "However common money seems to us from our constant use of it, we should consider how good reason our forefathers had to amass it." And he says in another place that it is certain that moneyers were established for the particular use of the public. That is the end of chapter 1. And I just want to say shout out to Guy Swan, who, he's reading articles, but he does it a lot smoother than I just did right there. So. But I think calling it the artificial riches is really a good kind of another term for money. Because like you said, even using a gold standard, if you had gold, that was great, but you couldn't eat it. Its value wasn't for building with it and this stuff. And it becomes more obvious with Bitcoin, since it is purely a digital thing.
Mm-hmm.
You really can't do anything with it other than use it for exchanging your value. There is no first use case, no commodity case for it. So it's like we said a little bit before, it's a way for society to show who has provided the most value for everybody else. Because if you're producing things and trading things, obviously the person with the most money will have been the one who contributed the most to society, because people are trading with them.
Meaning they're both winning in that transaction.
Right.
So you do a lot of winning, you'll get a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Or a lot of wealth, I should say.
Right. So we're both into Bitcoin, and we talk about Bitcoin a lot. Maybe we kind of take it for granted because we like to say that Bitcoin's going to become money, and we say that it's the hardest monetary asset out there. There's only ever going to be 21 million of them, and we can plan that out because we know the emission schedule of the Bitcoin. And it's also very, very, very hard to change that, and we know with fiat money that it's just unbelievably easy for the people who control it to change the supply of the money. And even gold, as you look through the history of it, even though it's the hardest money we've had, not including Bitcoin, which is not money yet, which we'll get into. But even still, they were able to inflate it, whether they were doing that with fractional reserve banking or, as what Erasme talks about in De Moneda a lot, is that they were the princes and the governments that were controlling the money tended to do some clipping, or
shave off the edges,
right? Or they would remint coins, but when they did it, they would use more alloys,
right?
And so they didn't have as much gold in there, but they didn't tell the people that.
But it still eventually led to inflation.
Yes, well, that was the inflation. Is that?
Yep. Like the price, everything. There was real trouble in Rome with that.
Right, and then the people who did figure that out, they would, there's so many problems with that. Is that one of the things that Erasme talks about is how the people who understood that there wasn't as much gold in the coin, but they were still calling it the same amount. Well, they would go over to foreign lands and trade it there. And get more money out of it because the people were ignorant of the way they were minting the money, and so that society ended up losing a lot of their gold,
right? Because
it incentivized people who were a little bit in the know to go trade it to make a profit off it,
right?
For doing that. But one of the things, and what makes taking a step aside, changing gears a little bit, what makes Bitcoin so interesting is that it started about 10 years ago, and we now have the opportunity to watch it in real time monetize. We have a history of how the dollars and other fiat monies came into being, but they weren't through market interventions. They existed because they're pretty crummy forms of money, as any libertarian listening to this understands. You're losing your value every second that you hold it. And that only happens because, governments force us to use their money. But we don't know exactly how gold monetized as far as like having a history book of it.
As far as we know, I mean, right. It's been money for a long time.
Yeah, and there's some history behind it, and we have a pretty good idea. And Mises did a great job with the regression theorem to say that hey, at some point it was used as a commodity, and people were trading it before they were using it as a medium of exchange. But it's still not like this clear-cut case where you can say this is exactly what happened, especially because it was happening across several societies. We see in different societies. We talked about the ray stones of the island of Yap before, how they use that as money, and we saw how
glass beads and seashells and
and we can see how those less sound monies are overtaken by the harder monies, like gold. When someone else comes in. Someone from Europe who they were using gold as money already come into these other societies and just kind of take advantage of the fact that they can produce their monies pretty easily.
Right.
But it gets talked a lot about, and I've come to realize a lot of people don't really understand. A lot of when these Bitcoiners talk about Bitcoin's monetization, they get confused. And I wrote an article the other day about Carl Menger and about the monetization of Bitcoin. So we'll link to that in the show notes page, because I was kind of going into it, but I didn't really spend all that much time explaining the differences, because for one, we talk about money being a medium of exchange, and we say Bitcoin is a medium of exchange, but then we say, well, in its monetization process, it's not a medium of exchange yet. And so, it's reasonable for someone to be like, well, wait, you're saying two things at the same time. But there's a difference. We're trying to specify or distinguish between the function of money as a medium of exchange versus its stage of monetization, which one of them is medium of exchange. So, I don't know. Do you want to talk about? Well, let's talk about the functions of money first. And
Well, yeah, like what makes a good money?
Sure. So, first of all, I will appeal to Carl Menger, who wrote a lot about this, and who I was using for this article. But it's first and foremost has got to be a medium of exchange, and that makes sense, right? Because money's got to be the third thing that you use in indirect exchange.
Right.
So if you can't like trade it again, then it's really not can't be money.
It's not really holding. Well, yeah, right.
Not even, yeah. So
yeah, not even there. Yeah.
Right. And then down the line, as something monetizes it, as something goes through its monetization, it takes on other functions. One of them being store of value, the other one being unit of count. And we'll get into unit of account later on. That's just better to explain when we talk about the stages of monetization. But we can take, let's say we have two things that might be used as two things in a society, two assets that might be used as money. Both function just as well as a medium of exchange. They act as kind of the third thing for trade, and they're equal in every sense of their functions or properties, except one thing. Except one thing tends to be valuable more as time goes on. So it stores value better.
What do you mean by that?
By it tends to be worth
so
more.
So you say you have two things that are essentially the same in all their properties, but one will be worth more in the future. One, how do we know that? And do you have like some kind of example, or is this what you believe will be more valuable in the future? Maybe I'm being a little bit too much, but you could
saying it's asset A versus asset B.
Right, and you think one loses value over time?
Well, no, not that they lose value over time, but one is more difficult to mine than the other.
Okay.
And so you have less of it.
Okay.
Over time. So let's say that asset A is more difficult to mine, and asset B is a little bit easier to mine, and so you would expect to have more of asset A or more of asset B as opposed to asset A in the future. So therefore, all else equal, the value of
gotcha.
Right, of A is going to be greater than asset B.
You assume so.
Right. And so we would say that asset A would be a better store of value. So what would you expect people to tend to adopt as money more? It would be asset A, right?
I'm sorry, I have some noises in the background here that I keep muting my mic and unmuting my mic, so I apologize first. Secondly, no, when you say money, you mean what you want to hold or what you want to spend?
No, well, what would become? Well, all right. I need to take a step back. Money is one thing. Money is the one thing that society uses. Yeah, I should have written out in that line for this, because it is important to say that, because a lot of people like to say that, you can have multiple monies in a society, which is not true at all.
Right.
The reason that may have happened in society in the past is because the money that they were using had certain qualities that made it not as efficient. But the best case scenario is a society uses one thing, because it makes economic calculation a lot easier to do. If you've got multiple monies that you're using at the same time, they are going to have their values fluctuate against each other, and it makes it very difficult to figure out profit and losses. A good example of this right now is we have LibertyMugs.com, and we accept both U.S. dollars and Bitcoin. And it's a pain in the butt. if you try to figure out like how much money you've made, because the value, some people pay in Bitcoin, some people pay in dollars, and the prices, the values
Change.
against each other fluctuate. So it's really difficult, and we manage it because we use some sort of, just kind of what I do is I just assume the value of the Bitcoin at when it was sold to us, and kind of use that in my little accounting that I do. Is that the best way to do it? I don't know. I'm not an accountant. Probably have the. It should. I know you're not an accountant, Slappy, but you come from finance, so maybe.
Sure. I get on that.
Yeah, we're the wrong people doing the wrong jobs in this.
Yeah, seriously.
But we've made $1 billion in sales, so I guess we're not doing
this
that.
In the first 6 months this year, right? That doesn't include July and August, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that's gross, not net.
Okay.
So,
there was some expenses there.
Right. But money should be one thing. It really has to be one thing. If you want to argue with us on what the Austrian economists have said in the past, I can direct you to plenty of literature where they reference money being the one thing. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. It's kind of interesting that is a question now, that you can have multiple monies.
Uh-huh.
But I think we'll kind of answer that why, because
I
was talking to someone and they were like, well, they were trying to argue that Bitcoin is money.
Right now.
So and like, well, it proves that, we have dollars and we have Bitcoin, so it proves you can have multiple monies.
Right.
And it's like, well, no, if you go by kind of the way that we describe how something monetizes, that Bitcoin is not yet money.
And most people, I mean,
but
if you're making a living and only accepting Bitcoin, if you want to buy anything, you're probably gonna have to change it to US dollars somewhere along the line.
Right, unless you happen to find someone who is willing to barter with you. In every case, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, and so that's why it doesn't make sense to have multiple monies. And anyway, if you did have a society that tried to use multiple monies, one thing, because everything has different properties, one thing would tend to serve the purposes or the functions of money the best, and so people would tend to use that one thing. And if you always have to exchange into that one money, then what's the purpose of holding everything else?
Right.
Of anything else? Because that's what people want to accept. But again, I know we're jumping all over the place, and hopefully this isn't too confusing, but we'll kind of talk about this kind of thing as we go through the monetization process. So, so back to the example of asset A versus asset B. Asset A is the one that's a little bit more difficult to mine as opposed to asset B, and that's really the only difference between the two. And we'll also, for the sake of this discussion, say that you can tell the two apart. It's not impossible to tell the two, since I'm saying they have their properties are the same otherwise. So, because you would have less of A than B, then
I'd rather have A.
Right.
I know that in the future. So if it's easier to mine B, more people will be mining it because it's cheaper to mine it. Well, when we say easier, whatever, it's probably less expensive to mine. More people could go into that if they wanted to, which would inflate it. So I'd rather have the one that's harder to mine.
Right, and this is where you can apply Gresham's and Thier's law a little bit. So Gresham's law is that it's
bad money drives out good money.
Yes, but that's under the condition that a state exists with legal tender.
Yeah, and we see this when the U.S. I guess it's they stopped minting silver coins.
Mm-hmm.
Those silver coins went out of circulation pretty quickly. People would save them and spend the coins that were made out of whatever they're made out of today. like your quarters, half dollars, silver dollars, which are no
Sure.
longer silver. So people would save the silver. And I know my grandparents saved a ton of silver coins. My dad's got a ton of silver coins. I never get them in my change. I've gotten a few in my life. And I haven't had one in over 10 years because I remember the last time I got one. So, and of course, part of that is those coins are old, but people saved the silver and spent the alloys that were being made.
Right. And then the opposite of that is Tyr's law that says kind of good money drives out bad, and it seems like it's a contradiction, but it's really not, because in the case of something like Bitcoin versus the U.S. dollar, people are going to the good money in Bitcoin. People are going to demand it as payment and try to sell off their fiat, their U.S. dollars, and so that's going to drive down the price while driving up the price of Bitcoin.
Well, and that's
again,
why, I mean, that's kind of, it's like I'm not the expert on this, so it might be misspeaking, but it's kind of like what happened with the silver, because people wanted to hold the silver because they thought it would be more valuable in the future as
Right.
opposed to these alloys. So they wanted to hold on to them. It's not like, all those silver coins got lost in the couch cushions and whatever. I mean, people held them and purposely didn't change it, go to the coin counter to change it to dollars unless at some point they had to sell silver or whatever the case is. But a lot of people held on to those silver coins because, they don't really want to save the quarter. It loses value over time, the new quarter.
Right. So, and again, so hopefully you're not totally confused
Yeah.
at this point, because and we'll go over briefly that money has three basic main functions. It is a medium of exchange, it is a store of value, and is a unit of account. And again, we're kind of delaying unit of account, although we touched on it a little bit when we talked about trying to figure out profit and losses, and the difficulty it is when you're trying to manage multiple monies or currencies that you're dealing with. And it also, just as not an aside, but talk about a little bit more, that it makes international trade a little bit more difficult when say you're trading with the Chinese, and you gotta exchange your, what's it, the yuan they use or something,
Yeah.
the yuan.
Yeah.
So you've got to exchange your dollars for the yuan and vice versa, and it just adds another layer of difficulty. It's not necessarily inexpensive in the sense that when you make that exchange, you're probably paying someone a fee to do that. So it just makes it more difficult. I mean, just use a little bit of common sense, and if you can remove steps from you trying to do something, it makes life a lot easier. So I think now we can try to kind of transition into the stages of monetization, because I think people get confused a little, well, not confused, but when they talk about a gold standard, and why gold has value, that it seems to be, the way they talk about it, it almost implies that someone just kind of found a piece of gold and said, hey, let's just use this as money. And it's not the case at all, because gold was I don't know the exact numbers, but gold was known by man for, a time, I don't know how long, but a time before it became money, used as money. But how could it go from just like digging it out of the ground and finding it to being like, oh, hey, we should use this as the third thing, as something that we can use as a way to indirectly trade for the things we need, and use this gold as a way to signify who has value, who's brought a lot of value. And if I trade my wheat for your gold, that I know that I could trade my gold for a pair of pants. So do you have any thoughts on what happened? Why what step there was between those two things?
Do I have thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure.
I think a guy found a gold nugget and took it to and said, I'll trade you this for a cow.
Sure. So why?
No, of course not. No. Yeah, I mean, they wanted to trade for something that could be useful or needed, or it's like you said, that third thing. So if I have cows and you have chickens and you can't trade one cow for, I mean, you could trade one cow for one chicken, but it's probably, the guy with the cow would probably think that wasn't really a fair trade, so he might want 40 chickens, but he might not have a need for 40 chickens, and you can't chop up his cow. So we have to go to something that other people will demand. Right. Now, how this gold, how did it, I mean, I imagine people were collecting it, holding it, keeping it. Maybe it was shiny. Maybe it was used as jewelry. It's small, or it could be small and valuable in small sizes. People were probably using it as ornaments, like earrings, necklaces, decorations. And it became somewhat universal, and people needing that, wanting it, collecting it, and having it on hand. And so then it became tradable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. There's a great piece, and I'll link to this in the show notes page. It's called Shelling Out by Nick Szabo, that talks about how things like gold and other things that were used as money first had this kind of like ornamental or collectible value, almost like heirlooms that people could kind of make stuff. It showed
it was useful. It was something nice, you could.
Yeah, and it was something that couldn't be made real easily. Something that obviously took some time to make, something that the people who had it assigned some value to it.
Right.
And kind of, and gold, humans tend to like things that are pretty. And so gold was something that most people, like the look of, like, to wear it, like you said, use it as jewelry, maybe make cups out of it. And it showed, and since it was difficult to come by, and it was
also, especially if you think of primitive time, I mean, it's pretty malleable. It's easy to...
Right. You can shape it.
So it was probably useful for several things.
Mm-hmm. And so if you had, gold cups or earrings or anything else, other people tended to want that.
It doesn't tarnish. It's useful metal.
Yeah. And so because other people kind of wanted it, you can see kind of where we're going to the next stage of it being a store of value. And I kind of alluded to this with the talking about it as being like a family heirloom. It's something that you pass down across your generations. You wouldn't just pass something down because it wasn't valuable to you, right?
Right.
It has some value assigned to it, and that doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that anything that has value to you is going to have value to other people. There's certainly things in my family, or that I own, that has a certain sentimental value to me that is absolutely worthless to someone else. But like we're saying, people tended to like, wearing gold as jewelry or using it for whatever reason. Those family heirlooms kind of became valuable. And they could be used to trade a little bit. Like, hey, if you didn't have, if you were trying to make a deal with someone, and you didn't have, I don't know, let's say you're a farmer and you're producing a lot of wheat, and the other person was a farmer too, that you were making a trade with for a big trade. And they also farmed wheat. They're like, well, I don't need your wheat necessarily, and it's probably, even if I did take your wheat, knowing that other people were going to want it, I'm probably not going to be able to sell it quickly enough or trade it quickly enough before it spoils. So I want something else that
it's going to retain value.
And so they might say, oh, hey, let me get some of your earrings or something. Let me get that family heirloom. And if it was worth it, then they'd make the deal. And again, Szabo talks about this in Shelling Out, how he talks about dowries. When women were, there's when a family gives their daughter up for marriage, the groom's family usually had to give some sort of payment for it. And since, marriage was a valuable thing, they ended up giving away some, whether it was cattle, which not ironically was used for money by some societies, and other things like family heirlooms. So as people start to see the value of of these items like gold, and we'll transition back to Bitcoin, because we're seeing, that's what we're saying, that we're the stage that we're in right now is the store of value stage. Is that people see that there's or speculate that the value is going to be worth a lot more than it is in the future. I mean, it will be
more
more
in
the future than it is now. Sorry.
Today, right?
Yeah. So with something like gold, people recognize that it had kind of a universal value, and that someone was always going to want it, and so if they held on to it, they were going to be able to use it in the future for something that they needed. It was a great way to well, what's the purpose of money? The purpose of money is to deal with future uncertainty. So if you had something that you believed was going to still be valuable in the future, especially if it was appreciating in value in the future, then you know it could be, then it's worthwhile to hold on to keep
it and hold it if it's going to be worth more.
Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be money right there, even if everyone kind of wants it. There needs to be another stage of this process, and that's where we get to the stage of widespread use. And again, this is all kind of, I forgot to mention earlier, that each stage you have to preference it with saying widespread use of. So widespread use as a collectible, then widespread use as a store of value, and then now for medium of exchange, the widespread use as being a medium of exchange. So we kind of already established in the beginning that it has to be able to be used as a medium of exchange at basically from square one. So like Picasso painting isn't really a good medium of exchange because there's only one of it, and so
can't really divide it up.
Yeah.
That would destroy its value.
Yeah, but gold, you can divide it. You can verify what it is. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do. But Bitcoin, obviously there's 21 million of them, but you can divide them into 100 million parts, into 100 million satoshis per Bitcoin. So that solves that problem, like the obvious nature of the difference between like gold and Bitcoin and a Picasso. But so what happens when people continue to demand this one thing to store their value, let me try to say this well. People are all demanding one thing as payment. It means that in order to get what you want, you're going to have to trade that too. So we see Bitcoin in this kind of in the store of value stage right now. Is that fiat and dollars are still strong enough that you can trade them back and forth, and people are willing to accept them. Like at Liberty Mugs, we accept dollars. We're happy to take your fiat money in exchange for mugs. But what happens? But we also, are more than happy to accept Bitcoin. And at some point, as Bitcoin appreciates in value more and the dollar loses its value, there's going to come a point where people aren't going to. There's going to be a premium you have to pay in order to for someone to accept the weaker asset. So if let's say we sell a mug for let's not use Liberty Mugs. I don't want people getting the wrong idea of what our prices are. But let's say you're selling shirts, and you sell a shirt for $10 each, and you sell, you're willing to sell the equivalent shirt for $10 worth of Bitcoin. But if you expect that the dollar is going to be losing its value so much that in order for you to accept dollars, you're going to then charge $11 for the shirt, but still only $10 worth of Bitcoin because you expect the appreciation versus the depreciation of Bitcoin versus the US dollars. So there's going to become that difference in the price. And that's just going to get worse and worse until the point that people are just not going to accept the dollars anymore, the weaker monetary asset. And so you reach this point where the only way that you can make trade is that you have to give up the thing that you're demanding in payment as well. And that's when you have the widespread medium of exchange, because that's what's being traded among people. It's the only thing that people are going to accept as payment, because now it is the most liquid thing, the thing that you know, if you have it, that you know you're going to be able to trade to get something else that you need. Because if the dollars are losing their value so much, you know that it's going to be, if you accept dollars in payment for something, you know it's going to be really, really difficult for you to trade them for someone else. And if you do find someone, by the time you trade those before, just because it's losing its value so much. Does that make sense, Slappy?
Yeah, except for you kind of broke up about 10 seconds ago.
Do you know?
And it went like totally blank. But yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
Do you remember what I was in the middle of? In case, I don't know if the recording.
Yeah, I don't know if the recording picked it up or not. You were talking about knowing that people will accept your Bitcoin for trade. You know, so you'll want to demand Bitcoin more than the U.S. dollars because it'll be harder to find someone to trade U.S. dollars with, and then it started cutting out.
Okay, yeah, that's basically the main gist of what I was saying.
Yeah.
The rest was kind of just whatever. Yeah, and just so to reiterate that's the point where it's the widespread medium of exchange, because you have people demanding Bitcoin or gold or whatever else we're saying is monetizing, and not accepting anything else. And so that's when it becomes kind of the one thing. And then from that, you know, that last stage, the unit of account, is that's what everything is. You stop, if Bitcoin becomes money, you stop putting prices in dollars, you start putting prices in Bitcoin. Because that's where it makes it a lot easier to.
Right. Instead of buying a cup of coffee for $1, you'll buy it for 3 Satoshi or whatever the case is.
Right. Because that's what everyone's trading in, so you wouldn't. That would assume that would take over as the in the pricing system, and so that's what everyone talks. That's what everyone trades in. It makes it a lot easier to do economic calculation, as opposed to if you were trying to, I don't know, let's say you're gonna build a house, and some people priced the guy who sells you the bricks sells them in Bitcoin, but then another competitor from him sells them in dollars. And so it's not necessarily straightforward to know who you're getting the better deal from. Maybe the guy who sells lumber sells it in dollars too, and a guy who sells concrete sells it in Bitcoin. So if you're trying to estimate how much it costs to build this house, it's very difficult to do. It adds another step, and it adds a way that, depending on who you're buying what from, it's going to make the price fluctuate a little bit. So when you just have the single unit of account, everyone selling and buying everything in Bitcoin, it makes it that much easier to figure out. All right, what exactly is it going to cost for me to do this? And then based on how much you spent on it and how much labor you put into it, and when you go to sell it, you can actually figure out whether you made a profit or not.
Right.
So let's say you had Bitcoin and dollars and gold. We'll add another thing in there just to show that the more you add, the more really difficult it becomes. So you've got 3 different assets that you're trying to price things in, all fluctuating against each other in their own ways. Imagine trying to figure out, in the beginning, you spent 3 Bitcoin $200,000 and let's say a pound of gold, and you end up with 5 Bitcoin, $10,000, and a pound and a half of gold. Like,
What's a better deal?
right? Yeah, it adds layers that make it confusing and difficult. So, you know, world's a little bit better off just using the one thing. So,
And it makes sense to do that for, there's, like you're saying, there's costs to using different money. It's just more efficient to have one. It's easier to trade with one.
Yeah,
and that's why we'll move toward that.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at the SAI pencil and see that like all this economic calculation happens without someone having to kind of oversee it. It all happens naturally.
Just happens.
But can you imagine how much more difficult it would be, and how much more expensive a pencil might be if you're having to use a lot of different things that are money? And yes, of course, right now there's probably international trade that goes on using different monetary standards to make that pencil. But again, it adds a layer of friction.
It's another
layer of cost.
Because when you buy something in Europe and it's a seller in Europe and you go to PayPal and spend dollars, there's someone trading those dollars for euros or whatever. It's not like, or they're accepting the US dollars, but it doesn't happen magically. There has to be a buyer and seller, which is where the price comes from between the two currencies. So that's another cost involved there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. I kind of got sidetracked in my head on where I was going with that. But it's not like when you buy something for euros and you use your PayPal and dollars come out of your bank account, those dollars get sold to someone for euros. We don't see it happening. It's happening behind the scenes. So it feels like you're spending your dollars for something in Europe, but someone was taking those dollars and trading them for euros and giving them to the merchant who was accepting euros for whatever he was selling to you. It's another layer. It's another added cost in doing business.
And it probably doesn't seem like a big, because I know it is for me. We live in a world of international trade, and who knows where we're buying stuff from. And it's not a big deal for you just buying things every once in a while. But if you're a business and you're trying to buy
trading
and sell
with different countries and different currencies, and
it makes it difficult if you don't put it all in one unit of account.
Especially with large deals, and some money is more stable than others, and you don't know what the price is. You have to make a judgment on how much your money is going to be worth tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
When you make a huge deal today,
right?
Which wouldn't happen if there was one money.
Yep. So again, just to kind of review, because I know we're kind of jumping around a lot. And it's not the most straightforward thing to understand anyway. I know it took me a while to try to figure this out, and even though I'm pretty confident I have a pretty good understanding of it, it's still difficult to try to explain it well off the top of your head. So the 3 functions of money are that is a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a unit of account. And then similarly named but different in their applications is the stages of monetization, where you have something that is widely used as a collectible, widely used as a store of value, then widely used as a medium of exchange, and then widely used as a unit of account. And we can also interchangeably use the word universally instead of widely used. Universally is probably easier to understand. And when we say that, again, should have mentioned this earlier, but that just means across the society. So you can have, it only makes sense that you would have a global monetary standard when there's international trade happening.
Right.
We're so connected by the internet that it makes it really easy to exchange things back and forth. But if you've got some island that doesn't have the internet and kind of just does their own thing, then you would expect them to have their own monetary standard independent of everybody else. because
And they're not
interacting.
partaking in the market,
Right, just
the
like
global market.
when we talked about earlier with the Yapstones and the seashells and everything, that they had their own, monetary standards because they weren't interacting with other people. And as
Right.
soon as they did start interacting with other people, then the harder money overtook them. Right.
Right.
As opposed, although, the other cases and that's with the natural money, a market money, obviously with governments involved and force and fiat, that standard can be achieved through violence, but obviously that's not what we're going for. We want the markets to decide these things, and so it makes sense that the hardest asset, the thing that best serves as money, the best tool for that job, is the one that's going to win out. So I don't know.
I mean, no, I think we accomplished what we want. Kind of a little over the place. Hopefully, it was easy to follow.
Well, it's tough because like these things. That's the other point that should be made. These things don't happen like independently of each other. It's all these things are kind of happening together. There's kind of there, like we said before, there might be some people out there that live their entire lives in Bitcoin, and they are able to use it as a unit of account. But obviously, that's not a universal thing yet. There's people that are using, and they're also not only using it as a unit of account, but also obviously as a medium of exchange, and that's what they use. And so it's got to function as it goes through these stages. It's got to function as the stage before it. So
Right.
if you're being widely used as a medium of exchange, then you have to be being widely used as a store of value, but the opposite's not necessarily true. So you could be universally or nearly or reaching the point of universal use as a store of value, but not quite yet as a unit of account, a medium of exchange, because the market isn't such that the current money isn't weak enough yet that it would not be demanded yet.
Right.
So it's a pretty complex system that's going on, and you can't expect it to just be like this kind of very linear thing. It's kind of grabbing different people and places and things as it kind of moves along, like this big globular thing that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So, obviously, if you want to dig deeper into this, if you have any questions, if anything was kind of confusing and you want to pick our brains, just DMs are always open on Twitter. You can email us.
Slide in his DM.
Oh yeah, more than happy to talk about it. Questions are great because we might circle back and kind of talk about the question specifically. So it's a lot easier to stay on a topic when you're talking answering a specific thing. But also always recommended is the Bitcoin Standard. That is an excellent book talking about Bitcoin and how it's going to monetize. Also the aforementioned Ethics of Money Production and Daemonada. I'm about halfway through Daemonada. It's not that long of a read, actually.
I have not read it, but maybe I will.
Yeah, but what I've read so far, I think it's worth the read. So I don't know, Sappy. Anything else you want to talk about on that front?
No, I think we covered plenty.
All right. We didn't talk about this.
Free market story.
Yeah. What do you got?
Do you have one?
I'm trying to think of one.
Yeah, well, one is you have governments forcing people to use different monies, and the market comes up with a way to trade anyway.
There you go. Perfect.
There it is.
Bitcoin fixes that.
Fixes that, right?
Fixes a lot of stuff. Yep. So, nice and easy, short and quick.
There it is.
We can get you to watch your football game without. Oh, you might have missed the kickoff and maybe.
Starting right
Although,
now.
yeah, I was gonna say you're probably actually watching it right now.
It is on in the background. Well, it's
Okay.
the game hasn't started yet. We're waiting for this kickoff.
Okay. So we'll wrap this up right now. McFlugel.com/160 is the show notes page. We'll link to a lot of the stuff we talked about, including my article, some of the articles we mentioned, and also the books. So I think that's it. Anything else,
Cool.
Slappy?
I got nothing.
All
Go
right.
Irish.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week.
Peace.